history of music in the South, and Texas in particular, is so convoluted that oftentimes one scarcely knows where one idiom leaves off and the next one begins. The man who has done more than just about anybody I can think of to put all that wealth of information and idiomatic influence into perspective is Dave Oliphant, our guest on the installment here of Jazz Perspectives. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
Where does this career come from? You've just published a memoir that rounds up a great many influences into your own body of work, and yet the first impression that springs to mind when I hear the name is as a preeminent historian of Texas jazz.
Well, I would say that it began in Altus, Oklahoma, actually. We moved from Fort Worth when I was 9 and a half, and my mother had the bright idea one summer, I guess, to get me out of the house or get me out of the yard where I was usually playing, to send me to a summer camp, music camp.
Yes.
And it wasn't anything I was very interested in. And I found that I didn't really like the director, who would bang me on the head with his baton, with the knob end of his baton.
I think we had the same director at one point or another.
Couldn't keep time. And so, as I tell in the memoir, I used to climb up in a tree on the corner and wait for the other kids to come. My mother didn't know I had not been going to the band rehearsals. And she noticed our dog sitting under the tree looking up one day, and she thought he had treed a cat. So she went to pull him home, and she looked up, and there I was sitting in the tree with my horn case. But she took me to the band director, and he said that he would work with me if I wanted to stay. And she said, "It's up to you. Either you do or you don't." Yeah. And probably the best decision I ever made in my life, I said, okay, I'll stick with it. And as a result, staying with the horn, I never was that good, but when I got to high school in Beaumont, the music teacher there, the orchestra teacher, was a real jazz fanatic, and he played alto sax and had heard Charlie Parker and Miles Davis in St. Louis, because that's where he was from.
What year was this when you got to Beaumont?
I think that we moved there in '53.
So the Parker influence would have been very fresh.
He was still alive,
yes.
and the teacher would bring recordings, and I, had no idea, but in '55 that the man had died. I just knew the music, but I didn't, and I knew I loved it, but I didn't really get into the sort of history until my mother one Christmas bought me an issue of the Encyclopedia of Jazz, put together by Leonard Feather, the very first one, 1960, 59 or 60.
Brilliant.
And reading in there about the musicians, and just, one thing led to another. I just became another fanatic about the history of the music. And then I began to notice Texans. And of course, that really caught my eye.
Right. And
in Beaumont, actually, I lived on Florida Street with my family, and I discovered that the old house where Harry James had lived, close to downtown Beaumont, had been moved out and relocated on Florida Street. So I used to pass his old house. So these kinds of connections, just they came together, and little by little, I just took a more and more profound interest in Texans in jazz history, and that led to my several books.
I guess so. Was Parker the first jazz artist you actually heard to recognize what you were hearing?
I would say that what struck me most was Duke Ellington and Jelly Roll Morton. And I used to bring these recordings that I found to the high school, and the other band members said, "Oh, that old hokum stuff. Oh, because this was the 20s and 30s that I was playing.
Right.
But that was the music just knocked my socks off.
You and me both, yeah. I still, when everything else wears thin, I always go back to Beiderbecke or Jelly Roll.
Right. Yeah.
One of those.
I'm the same way.
So you didn't, really make distinctions, except in terms of personal taste. If you were digging the progressives, then you were also responding to the swing period and to the prototype.
I liked all the periods. I will say that after about 1970, there was a period in there that I wasn't that interested in and didn't really keep up as much as I had in the 50s and 60s. There were still people like Ornette who were active in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right on up till this new century. But there were a lot of, for me, I guess they were rehashing the music more. There wasn't that much originality or the type of jazz that I really identified with.
It took me personally a long time to accept the synthesizer as a real musical instrument, but no accounting for taste. I did develop an interest in Joe Zawinul.
Right, I liked him with the Cannonball.
Less so with Weather Report than on his own and with Cannonball. But the 70s, that was a good time to go back and rediscover the root material. The new book, tell us about that.
Now you're talking about the memoir.
The memoir,
right.
Yes.
Well, as usually happens to me, either someone suggests something or I make some connection. In this case, my wife had been after me for years to make a list of all my publications. And she said, before you forget them and where they appeared and when. So I started keeping a record, and this was probably in the early 90s, going back and tracking down publications, ephemeral publications. And so for Christmas, sometime in the 90s, maybe it was 92, I gave her a bibliography for Christmas that I had compiled. You know, it was kind of a surprise to her. And then I continued to add to it. Once I could put it on a computer, it was easy to update it. And then I had more appearances in magazines, and then actually many more books appeared after that date than I had had previously. So then thinking about expanding it and maybe printing out another, a better looking bibliography, I thought, well, maybe I should write a little bit about every book.
Right.
What was the background, you know, what was I thinking, how did it come about? It turned into an autobiography. I sort of dropped the idea of just commenting on each book and started writing a narrative.
Right.
And I really began the memoir in 1959, and that was the first time I had something published. And I also, that same year, it was the first time I ever wrote a poem. I was reading poetry and became very, very enmeshed in the whole poetic creativity. And so that was my first year to write a poem, and it was also the first year that I had something published. And that was a piece on Charles Ives.
Yeah.
And it was published in the Lamar Tech literary magazine in Beaumont, now called Lamar University, but when I went there it was Lamar Tech.
Oh my gosh. So
I started there, and then I would work my way back to my birth here, actually in Fort Worth,
right.
and my early years here, and my relatives, and my mother moved back here. My mother and dad moved back, and then he died fairly soon after that, and then she lived on until 2005. So I was always in Fort Worth, in and out.
Right.
You know, really all my life I've been here, and since she's passed, I still come up. I have a few cousins here, and I come up here to see them, and my archive is at TCU.
Right.
I gave all my archive of my own writings and also my press, Prickly Pear Press,
Sure.
that I edited for 25 years. So TCU has all that material there.
You've certainly become a mainstay of the Jazz Archive program for the public library in Fort
Well,
Worth.
thank you.
That's,
I'm glad to hear that.
for a project that began so few years ago, it's grown immensely well.
Oh,
And,
that's great.
Of course, this very series of interviews that we continue to do. Apparently, there is an audience, and they appreciate the.
Well, certainly when I
content.
would go to jazz by the
The
boulevard,
uh-huh.
I mean, mobs showed up, and
Oh,
they
yeah.
really cheered and really. I haven't been to all of them, but I think I've been to 3, and all those were well attended and enthusiastic crowds.
Nice
It was great.
experience.
It was great. In fact, I wrote a poem that I'm very proud of. I've never gotten it published. It's sometimes hard to get jazz poems published because people don't know the references. But I did a piece, I just call it Jazz by the Boulevard, and it's about the concert when David Fathead Newman came, and
Right.
the tenor sax player from Dallas who died very shortly after that. What? Marshall
Ivory. Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that I wrote that poem and recalled, you know, exactly what I heard by them. I have all the tunes that I particularly struck me in the poem, and I talk about the location
Yeah.
there, the monument to Will Rogers and the Kimball Art Museum. I work all that in, so I really had a lot of fun with it, and it means a lot to me. Everything I've written about Fort Worth, of course, I have a sort of a sentimental attachment.
Well, of course, and the influence of hearing Fathead live in such an element. Wow. Yeah, Fathead, I sure do miss that fellow. He and my trio shared a drummer in common for
Oh, is that
several
right?
years, Dwayne Durrett. And gosh, what a terrible loss, but what a
Yeah,
tremendous legacy of accomplishment.
Marshall Ivory, that day really played beautifully. I really was so happy to hear him live. I had recordings, but I had never heard him live until that. Nor Fathead Newman either. I just had heard recordings.
Powerful stuff. You mentioned the discovery in Beaumont, the James House.
Right.
What, beyond that, would have been your first impressions of realizing that Texas had its own indigenous jazz scene that not only flourished within the state but also influenced a much broader scope?
Well, when I discovered Jack Teagarden, that really made me think, you know, wow. I mean, we had some big names from here. And even when I was in high school, I heard Jimmy Giuffre recordings, but I didn't know he was from Dallas. At that time, you know, my antennae were not trying to pick up on Texans, but I knew by, I'd say 57, 58, at least, maybe a little earlier, because I started buying Shorty Rogers recordings in the 50s, mid-50s, and there was Jimmy.
Yes.
So yeah, I probably maybe as early as 55, 56, I may have known that he was a Texan. And then in 59, I bought The Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette, and that was really big time. And I was hooked on Ornette the first time I heard The Shape of Jazz to Come.
My introduction to Ornette was one of the very few 45 RPM singles Atlantic did in jazz.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know
Una
that.
Muy Bonita, which is
Right.
still not the kind of thing you can walk away humming, but I think it's the most melodic composition Ornette has ever done. And of course, he considers himself today to have outgrown all that period by such a distance. It was like, no, this is great stuff, man. But
well, he still every once in a while writes these pieces that have a sort of Latin connection. There's one, what is it? Not Peppers. It's like PPP, Piccolo, something.
I'm not placing
It's on one of the late ones in the late 90s or maybe even this decade, 2000.
Well, that influence is inescapable in jazz. I mean, it's what Jelly Roll Morton called the Spanish tinge.
That's exactly right.
And what you hear in, well, New Orleans in particular, owing to the African Caribbean influences, but that whole Creole vibe that found its way into here, and it's like, which came first? Is this indigenous music? Is it immigrant music? Is it, what is it? I made a connection very early in childhood listening to Milton Brown that this is supposed to be country music, but that piano sounds like Father Hines. Mm. And of course, years later, when I met Fred Calhoun, the pianist, and started working with him and preserving his memories on tape recordings, that was exactly where he was trying to come from. Mm. And so
I mentioned in a section that I did on Milton Brown in my book, The Early Swing Era, I read something that connected him with Fats Waller. Of course, coming before, well, not before Hines, but right in that same tradition, almost the same period.
Right.
And I think that I read that he said something about Fats Waller.
Fred was a big admirer of Fats, although he didn't play stride. He didn't really play boogie. He played the style associated with Hines is called trumpet,
right?
Because of the percussive right hand.
Right.
Where does it all come from? It's just a big gumbo. What ingredient?
Well, that's what
first?
One of the things that interested me. We were speaking earlier of your hometown, Amarillo. And if my memory will serve me, there was a group in Amarillo very early in the 20s, maybe even earlier. I heard that this band from Amarillo had impressed Jelly Roll Morton in the 20s. Well, how did these people in Amarillo know about jazz, and how could they play at that level that early?
Yeah. Well, how was Don Roby getting rhythm and blues artists in Houston in 1959 to play so far above their heads that they actually became more sophisticated players in the process? How, once something gets into the air, into the water, it transmits like osmosis. And
Jack Teagarden said that he didn't know that what he was playing was called jazz.
Teagarden was, of course, the Vernon, Texas. Wait, you mean Vernon, Texas?
Right.
Yeah, there's a Teagarden museum going into Vernon.
That's right. That's right.
And none too soon, because a lot of people have forgotten.
No, when my book came out, Texan Jazz, I had so many readers tell me, I didn't know Jack Teagarden was from Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
it
amazed me that they didn't know that.
You listen to his duets with Johnny Mercer, and you'd think he's from Harlem. You listen to his late-in-life remake of I Cover the Waterfront, and you think he's like the masculine reincarnation of Billie Holiday. What a diversified player, in that almost Beiderbecke tone he got out of the trombone. Do these things happen up on the windswept, desolate plains of Texas? Well, apparently Jack Teagarden happens. But yes, as family connection and extended family connection, Jack was married to a cousin of a cousin by marriage of mine.
Oh, is that right?
Like, hey, my Uncle Jack, you know. And I think, let's see, my lap steel playing partner, Greg Jackson, Greg's Jack Teagarden was his grandparents' paper boy
Oh,
in
good.
Vernon. And you mean he was like a paper boy in a small town in the Texas Panhandle region, and he grew up to become this? Well, of course. That's where did Bob Wills come from? Absolutely nowhere. Kittaquay, level land, Lasbuddy, out in the middle of nowhere.
Turkey, what are they?
Turkey
Why did
claims him. I think
Oh, is that what-
Kittaquay is the
okay.
truer region,
Okay.
but it was not even a town.
Right.
And of course, a guy like Bob Wills, who what's he playing? Well, he's playing music. Well, what kind of music? Well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of everything else, and a whole lot of attitude and soul. And you play jazz and put a Stetson on while you're doing it, and you might be called Western Swing.
Right. Speaking of where jazz musicians come from that are really out in the boonies, out in towns that don't even have names, this is a case with Kenny Dorham, who's one of my favorite Texas jazz musicians, and he's usually, his hometown is usually given as Fairfield, which is about halfway between Houston and Dallas.
Right.
But he was actually born in about 6 miles out. I can't even remember now what I have it in my books, but my memory fails me, what the little settlement is called.
Yeah.
But, I mean, here is a major world figure, played with Parker at the International Festival in Paris in 1948, recorded all over Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. For me, one of the major figures, although he is always placed below Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie. But for me, I mean, as a Texan, of course, I'm partial. But here is a major world-class jazz musician coming from, I mean, really the sticks. It's just out nowhere. I tried to find the homestead, and I never could locate it outside Fairfield. But it's just amazing, as you say, there's something, it's unaccountable how it is that one person has this ear and this talent and the next person doesn't.
You hear it in the wind. You hear it in the trains going by.
Yeah.
Woody Guthrie could hear a passing train and detect the nuances of its whistle when most people would say, "What is that racket?" And then play what he had heard on a harmonica.
Yeah.
So
that's exactly what I've tried to do with Kenny Dorham. I've been working on a biography of Kenny in verse. It's all rhyming. No one will read it, no one will be interested, but I've been having a great time. I've written 41 pages of rhymed verse trying to trace his life.
Wow.
And I talk about the trains that he would hear, the birds that he would hear. And he grew up wanting to be a cowboy.
Yeah.
And he talks about that in a little autobiographical fragment that he wrote. And so I've tried to recapture something about where he lived and how that affected, those ears that became so incredible in terms of jazz.
In terms of not only hearing but feeling while hearing, and having the ability to translate ambient noise into melodic expression.
Yeah.
Where does it come from? I have no idea. You've done some considerable digging into a great favorite of mine, Gordon Beneke, Tex Beneke. What's your deepest impression of Tex? I know he's, apart from being largely forgotten today, despite his prominence in the last century, I find a lot of people have become unwilling, Leonard Feather amongst them, who was a friend and collaborator and had some terrible arguments with him over the worth to jazz of Tex Beneke. What's your feeling?
Well, I think that he was probably better known as a singer.
Yes.
But I love his tenor solos,
Mm-hmm.
and I have discussed those in a couple of my books,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel that every time I listen to them, I think they really stand up. I mean, it's not hokey, and I mean, they really swing, and a lot of good harmonic thinking is going on.
Yes.
So I don't agree with those who
I had a knockdown drag out with Leonard Feather when we were working with Jim Salas on the book The Guitar in Jazz. Leonard wrote some chapters, I wrote some chapters, Jim wrote a mixed bag of contributors, and Leonard helped a great deal with a chapter that I was doing on Oscar Moore, another great Texas jazz player from the Nat, yes, from the Nat Cole Trio, and it was not. I was still still rankled over Leonard's inclusion of Glenn Miller and Paul Whiteman on the list of 10 worst jazz artists of all time, and it's like, come on, man, look at the springboards these guys provided.
Sure, and Miller was a terrific trombone player.
Miller was a great
early
trombone player.
I mean, he could have continued as a fine soloist, and there is no denying the appeal of Miller's music. When for one of the Jazz at the Boulevard annual sessions, I came down, and a lady, I can't remember her name, I should, who's very active in putting these together, has been from the beginning.
Oh, Donna Van Ness.
Yes, Donna, exactly, Donna. She arranged for me to go to the high school out north here. Which high school would that be? Again, it's in my book.
I would have to look that up.
At any rate, I went out there and gave a talk on jazz. The auditorium was packed, and I mean, when I played I guess I played In the Mood. Yeah, that's what I played. I played a lot of jazz recording, and when I played In the Mood, those kids, I know they didn't know Glenn Miller's music.
No.
They got in the aisles and started jitterbugging, dancing.
Of
I mean, their version, I'm sure they didn't even know what jitterbugging was, but they could not resist the pull of that music.
The momentum, yeah.
Yeah.
I learned that. I've always had a kind of a back of the mind feeling that rock and roll would have been a lot less possible or likely without the influence of the swing period. Yeah. When the twist craze hit about 1959 or 60, following Hank Ballard's original composition and then the cover by a fellow called Chubby Checker. The town where I was growing up, Amarillo, there was a local DJ who dug out a bunch of swing band records from the 40s. Ted Weems's Heartaches from 36, some Glenn Miller, and started playing it on the radio as twist records. The record stores didn't know what to do because they were suddenly besieged by requests for recordings that had been out of print for 25 years.
Yeah.
And it was very strange, but the momentum was astonishing. Glenn Miller influence seems pervasive even today, even among people who've never heard of Glenn Miller. How do you explain that?
There's something about that music. I think Gunther Schuller said, that there's just no denying the appeal of that music. It just, it's fetching. It pulls you in. It draws you in immediately. There's something just stimulating about it, and I don't know. It's magic. I mean, for me, music, and especially jazz and classical music, are my favorite. There's always something miraculous about the music. I really cannot understand how it came about. But before we leave Miller, the other Texan and the other Fort Worth native that really interests me is Clyde Hurley, the trumpet player.
Oh yeah.
And he takes a solo on In the Mood. But I don't know enough about him. I have wanted to try to research him. There's a street here in town named Hurley, but I'm told that it's not named for his family. But I'd love to do some further research. I think he was a fabulous trumpet player.
I can hear that solo now, yes.
Yeah, and so those are two, and there are other Fort Worth musicians from that period. The drummer, what was his name? Also was with Miller later. He wasn't,
right.
And he actually took the band over after Miller's death.
There were successors and successors and successors,
right.
and
Tex Beneke, he
of course,
also directed it for
and
a while.
Mancini for a while.
Okay.
And as long as the charts survived.
Yeah.
But it's like honestly, for me, the ideal Glenn Miller recording showcases all those founding talents to one major extent or another, and usually has some kind of spoken aside from Glenn Miller himself. He's like, did you learn that from Bob Wills? No, I think he made it up. I think they both made it up. Something in the air, something in the water, and it infects and transmits itself. Where is Texas jazz bound in the new century?
Well, there certainly are musicians in the state that are promising.
Yes.
There are a number of people that I've heard in Austin, a trumpet player whose name I'm sorry I can't recall, that impressed me. I heard him live. It was at a special recognition at the Long Center in Austin, where the symphony plays and other types of music perform now. And they inducted 10 members of the Austin Music Hall of Fame. And Kenny Dorham was one of them. And so I was invited by his daughters. There were three of them that came, and I sat at their table, and this young man, and I'd never heard his name, they played some of Kenny Dorham's compositions at the celebration. And I was very impressed with his trumpet playing. I'm sorry I can't recall his name, but there are a lot of people. James Haslanger played in New York for a while, and he came back and stays very active. And I can see the growth in his talent over the years.
So when do you tackle the next book on the evolution of?
I don't know if I've got any more books in or not, except my biography in verse of Kenny Dorham.
40-odd pages into rhyme. I put me down for a copy.
Okay, well, I'm having a lot of fun with it, I tell you that. And I bring in really the history of jazz. The first section, I begin the first section in Denmark. Because he recorded there toward the end of his life. And so I begin there and then come back to his birthplace in Texas. But in that first section, I talk about all the greats who went to Denmark. I mean, Basie, Brubeck, Ornette was there. Right. He has 2 recordings, albums. What's it called at the Golden Circle?
Golden Circle.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I work all these people in, and Ellington, he went there, and even has a piece called something to Sweden. I can't remember the first word in the title. But at any rate, Sweden has figured very prominently in jazz, and the recordings that Kenny Dorham made with Scandinavians are fabulous, and the musicians are just top notch. So I'm having a great time with that history.
I'm eager to see the finished product. In the meantime, we've got a regular 5-foot shelf of your stuff to dig into. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For Jazz Perspectives, Mike Price. Thank you.